Welcome to another episode of Out of Bounds on the Boomer Bust podcast channel, a podcast where I give my social commentary on different topics in today's society. I'm your host, Terry, and today I want to have a open-minded discussion about Candace Owens and her comments about George Floyd and kind of the situation at large, and then really just some bigger societal concepts that she kind of pointed at through her statements. So I don't know much about Candace Owens. I believe she's a conservative or Republican, whatever. Obviously she's African American, and so there's already everything that goes into that. But previous to this, I wasn't really aware of her. I don't know her personally, so I'm not going to take the road. Obviously, I don't do the whole name calling thing on any of the content I do. But deeper than that, I'm not going to take the whole road of inferring, because as you go through discourse as a person that's online, especially during these times, you realize more and more and more how many people don't know how to have a conversation, how many people incorrectly do things. And one of those things is people add their own interpretation of things and take it as if it's fact. So I'm not going to do that. I am going to look at what she is saying, or what she said, I should say, and take it from there. So her whole I don't know if you would call it a speech, a statement, but her whole thing was centered around George Floyd. So really, I think there's three parts to this. And the first part is about George Floyd. Let's start there. So obviously, the idea of racial equality, the idea of police brutality, those are all being discussed right now through the Black Lives Matter movement in association, but also through the protest and for justice of George Floyd. And so George Floyd, who was murdered by a Minneapolis officer for no reason. There was not a conflict. There was no reason that he should have had to lose his life in that situation. So that's a pure fact. There's nothing to go against that. So what Candace Owens is saying, and she's not at all, she's repeated many times, I repeat again, she's not saying anything about the murder. She said that was a murder. It wasn't justified. It's never justified. And the officer deserves to get whatever happens to him. So the comments aren't about the murder. Her comments are about George Floyd as a person. And basically what she said many times throughout that whole statement is that she rejects this idea of using George Floyd as a martyr and saying that people are looking at him as if he's some type of hero and people are looking up to him, and she doesn't believe that's right because he wasn't a good person. She cites his criminal record, talking about the violent crimes he's committed, the time that he spent in jail, and then also the fact that he was he had meth in his system at the time of that arrest, which was confirmed by both autopsies. So again, not saying that is an excuse for what happened to him. She's just saying that as a figure for this movement, a martyr, if you don't know what that is, look that up. She rejects that because she doesn't feel that criminals or people that aren't good people should be looked at in that way. And so for that, a lot of people have this backlash because one part that is true, I think pretty succinctly, is that George Floyd, let me back up. People would immediately say to her in response that the protest is not about him being a good person. People aren't claiming he's a great person. This isn't about, saying he's a hero or anything. This is about and only about the way in which his life was taken from him. And to that, fully understand that point. However, people have to admit that George Floyd's name, especially right now, becomes synonymous with the idea of justice right now. We're talking about justice for George Floyd, for his family, for the way he was killed specifically. But in the grand scheme of things, we know how people are. People will mesh that together. Not to say that they will make him a hero, but his name is being synonymous with a quote unquote righteous cause. And so, again, not to say this is what Candace is saying, but in that mindset, someone could feel that it's not right to have his name be a part of that conversation. Now, this gets to a couple bigger things. Number one, it gets to this whole idea, which a lot of people I've heard say, why now? Why was George Floyd so different? Why is this special? Why is this the tipping point? And I had my discussion about that before in my episode talking about protests. You can check that out for the reasons I feel like. But in a nutshell, I don't think it was special. And that might be the problem. That might be the problem. It was just another one and another one. And I don't think that sits well with anybody. Now, I will not push back against anybody that's saying like it doesn't have to be special or whatever. I agree. Like the problem is it's just another one. That is the problem to me. But the idea that this is different, that's, I've seen people saying this is our civil rights, this is a revolution, all this stuff. That to me is ridiculous. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but there are people that put it on that pedestal in their mind because they just want to be a part of something. We have a very activist generation currently. And so that is what it is. But I wouldn't say that it's that. But I will say that it wasn't because George Floyd was some great stand-up person. And I think that's what Candace was hinting at. Again, not try to put words in the mouth, but when you're talking about looking at him as a hero, I don't believe that's what people are doing. And so to suggest that this is all happening just because of George Floyd, that's not true. It's basically, or I should say it's obviously for what it represents, which is, again, police brutality reform, the push for racial equality. And so in that sense, it doesn't really matter about the person. It's more of what it represents. And that's what a lot of people are saying. But I will push back, because this does bring up an interesting question. Now, I don't happen to agree with Candace Owens, but it does bring up a question that, again, if you conflate and you push everything together, you push police brutality equals racial equality equals George Floyd, all this stuff. If you push it together, then you don't leave any room for gray area. And gray areas where we have to have, because that's where we can have discussion. So my thought is, I pushed this to its logical step with Candace Owens, basically saying that it's problematic to have a person that was not a good person be a symbol for change. Not a symbol for change, but, have their name and their, likeness associated with a symbol for change. And so I think about this. What if it was a rapist? What if a rapist who, or let's just say that the person was killed in a arrest unjustly, but the person was a known rapist, like prior, or they found out that the person was a rapist, or that they were a pedophile, or that they were a murderer? What if it was someone like Bill Cosby, a Harvey Weinstein? Like, and that's the question I ask. Now, it might just be academic to have that psychological and philosophical thought process and debate, but I think there is merit in asking that question, where is the line? Because right now, you can look at George Floyd, somebody who has a criminal record, and you can say, all right, you know what, that doesn't matter. We're talking about what happened to him. Agreed. But I think it is easy to say that if it doesn't affect you, to be honest. Like, not even if they were a crazy criminal, but what if they were a regular criminal and they did it to you? How would you feel if you saw somebody that robbed you or beat you and they were killed unjustly by the cops? Would you then be upset about it? Would you feel comfortable seeing their name everywhere as a symbol for change? That's a question you got to ask. And I think it's fair to pose that question. I don't think it's unfair of Candace to ask that. And she didn't ask it directly, but I think her stance on George Floyd demands us to ask that question. And I'm just curious, because then what is the line? And as for myself, I would have to wrestle with that, because again, people can do things when they want to. You know, we can compartmentalize the two things when we want. Candace always pissed me off. So let me say, I can look at George Floyd unfairly killed by police, and I can separate that from George Floyd, the criminal. Which, okay, that's a way to look at things and not black and white. But then when we start talking about other things, then it becomes, oh, I don't care. It's this way or it's that way. And that becomes the problem. So if we are true to what we are saying about George Floyd, then it stands to reason that if it was a serial child pedophile, that they should not they should also have the same backing that George Floyd has. And so I think about that. And I think in my mind, I would agree, because that's the only way to be fair. But some people will be mad, and some people say, oh no, you did this, you deserve to burn, you deserve this. And then it becomes what you deserve and not what should happen. And so that's when justice really gets tricky. And like anything, whether we're talking about comedy and jokes, whether we're talking about justice, whether we're talking about sensibilities, it always comes down to what affects you. And so if you have a strong stance against a certain type of criminal, then you might be the one saying, no, I reject that. Now, my initial thought when I heard all of this was this idea that I'm not going to look at George Floyd as my symbol for this cause. Maybe you connect more with someone else, because unfortunately, we have so many people to pick from. And so maybe someone else's situation connects more with you. Someone that was innocently shot in their home when they weren't doing anything. Maybe that connects more with you than somebody that was high on drugs and has a criminal record, whatever. I feel like that's within your right to feel that way. I don't think it's anything to tear down the protest. It's anything to tear down the movement. I think if you just don't feel comfortable promoting this particular individual, I feel like that should be within your right. But part of that, you have to ask, does it matter? And not just Candace Owens asking, does it matter? But everybody else asking, does it matter? And really take it to its conclusion. What if it was somebody that killed your daughter or your son or your mother or your father or your brother, and then they were wrongfully killed the same way by the police? Would you feel, that they should be put up there like George Floyd is? That's a question you got to ask yourself. And I think the hardest thing to do is to be consistent, because it takes work. And that's where a lot of people have the issues with. All right. So that's one part, is the George Floyd part. Now, the second part, that I really push back against is the statistics. So she basically rattles off these statistics about first of all, the number of violent white criminals that were killed in, I forgot what year her stats she quoted. It was either 2018 or 2019. The number of violent white criminals killed by cops versus the number of violent black criminals killed by cops. I should say the number of unarmed people killed by cops, black versus white. And then she started talking about the percentage of violent criminals represented by black people versus represented by white people. And so she goes into those numbers. And then, of course, she links that into the statistic about police being more likely to be killed by a black criminal than the other way around, blah, blah, blah. And so, not to say blah, blah, blah to dismiss it, but I've worked a lot with numbers, as I've said many times. Stats has become one of the things that I never thought in my life I'd be so passionate about, because people use them so misleadingly. I do not love numbers. I use them to inform the situation. I like them, but I dislike them more because people either A, use it to be misleading, or B, they get so stuck in the number that they forget the context. Now, in my opinion, and really just listening to what she said, Candace Owens very much is stuck in the numbers. Now, she could be using them misleadingly. I don't know. I don't know her. So I'm just going to go with the other answer, that she has lost the context because she didn't bring up any of the context. And she actually said something completely erroneous. So she says it doesn't matter what percentage of the population you represent as a whole, as a racial category. It just matters what percentage you represent as a violent criminal. And that's not true. I mean, all those things inform each other, especially when you're talking about percentages. So when you're talking about the sample size, the population size, I should say, the population size very much influences the sample size, and so on and so forth. And so the fact that, as she brings up, our violent criminals, we're very specifically about violent crimes, is disproportionately represented by black people, when versus our population size, we have such a minority status, that in itself raises up a flag. So she uses these numbers as matter of fact, as if that's the way this is, and that's fact. Numbers only tell part of the story. So yes, the stats she have quoted, and I didn't check these, but even if I take them as true, they can be right. They can tell you what the picture is right now, but the point of stats isn't just to end the story, it's to start the story. So since the stats tell us this is the picture, now it is the job to have the conversation and use the qualitative data to figure out why. What are the underlying causes? What are the root problems? What ways can we change it? What affects it? All those things. And that's the biggest part she left out. So if we want to talk about the stats, as far as how many violent criminals are black, or we're talking about how many deaths are by black or are against black people versus white people, whatever, any stats we want that she brought up specifically, then you have to also take into it the context. And so it isn't just a matter of fact of this is what's happening because that's the way it is. Well, then you also need to discuss how did we get there. And so a lot of people will tell you that that is a tactic to just dismiss the conversation. And again, don't know her, don't know if she's using it that way, but it is a tactic to dismiss the conversation. I'm going to just throw these numbers out, these facts, these figures, as they say, and we're just going to leave it at that. No, you can't leave it at that, because you have to discuss how we got there. And I think a lot of people in the Black community, a lot of people that are, into the scholarly work of this are really into the idea of discussing the historical context. And I've had my contention with historical context before, but we discussed the historical context. We got to talk about the factors that led it to here, because you can't dismiss those. And so you can't dismiss everything else. If you're going to bring one part of the story in, you got to bring it all in. So we can't dismiss how the education is disproportional. We can't dismiss how the finance that's distributed is disproportional. We can't dismiss the historic context and story of African Americans and Black people in this country. We can't discount systematic racism. We can't discount any of that. So all that plays a part. The problem is if you don't bring that in, because to me it's not an excuse. Some people, and I'll get to that, some people using it as an excuse, but to me it's not an excuse. To me, if you don't bring that in, then what you're essentially saying is that here are the facts and those are inherent. They are this way because you are this way. And that's not true. That's problematic in itself. So whether she's willingly or unwillingly doing it, it's problematic. It doesn't matter if it's this context or any context. It doesn't matter if you're looking at the numbers of your sales at your company. When you just put the numbers in there, you are being problematic by leaving the context out, because now you're leading to decision making that's incomplete. So once again, she left a lot of that context out. And I think that's a big problem in her whole statement, because she uses, and again, it wasn't just her laying out the facts. She uses this to say the narrative about racially inspired police brutality is false. That's absolutely crazy, in my opinion. Not to say that's fact, but that's my opinion. That's my reaction to it, because there is no number that's going to capture that. You're going to have numbers as far as, like, she talks about number of violent criminals. She talks about number of arrests and all these different things. The problem is there's a lot of things that happen that aren't counted, right? Like racially biased police brutality isn't just physical. It isn't just, somebody being beaten up. If they decide to go beat somebody up and not report it or not arrest them, but they're just flexing their powers to be racist and show their dominance, that's not going to show up in anybody's statistics. You know what I'm saying? The things that people see from police, how they make them feel, that's not going to show up in anybody's statistics. Shoot, watch Detroit. I keep saying that. Everybody's talking about Just Mercy. Watch Detroit if you really want to be scared about police. Watch Detroit. See what they did to those people, to the white women and all these Black people. And none of the police got arrested. None of the people that night got arrested. 2 people died. And you tell me where that shows up in the statistic. It won't. And so, again, it's so much more than just a number that you're leaving out when you just throw a number out there. So to say these numbers is problematic in itself. But then to use these numbers to make the claim that there's no or disproportion or there's no racially bias, or let me be fair. She said that the racially inspired police brutality is disproportionate, and she said that's not true. So that's her claim, and I don't believe that. And I again would say to use just numbers to prove that is false and problematic at best. And so there's that. There's all that with the stats. There's probably more to dig into that, but essentially that's what it is. You can't leave the context out, because that paints the whole story. Now I'm gonna get to the part where I don't really disagree with her a whole lot. And this is one of the points that people aren't trying to hear, because they're so upset by what she said already that they're not trying to hear this part. And I don't totally agree with her, but there's some things you got to ask yourself. So, again, so she talked about George Floyd. She talked about the statistics. Now she ends up talking about the mentality. She basically talks about the victim mentality of Black people, and that we always turn to white people and blame them for problems. She talked about when you pull your phone out, you're always pulling your phone out to film white people and talk about what they're doing, but you don't do it when we do it, blah, 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 blah. And again, that's not to dismiss, that's just, I'm not quoting. All right, so I think Candace has a point in that when she says that, when she says the things about the stats and says that there's a myth about the disproportionality of, basically racism and with cops and police brutality, obviously, I think she's very far off base and she's missing context. Now, when she talks about this idea of us not always being accountable and kind of blaming white people, that's one I can't push too far back. Now, to me, again, we got to compartmentalize. These are different things. They don't equal the other thing. But when we're talking about this idea, not everybody, but that some people do get into that victim mentality, I agree with that. And it's not just conservatives said, it's not just Republicans. Obviously, there's different religious people, there's different figures throughout time that have felt this. And that in its simple form is that we can't keep asking people for justice. We have to create our own justice. Part of that thinking goes into the idea of protest and riots and demonstrations. But another part of that is that you have to get out of this idea that it's all the white people's fault. And I don't think that it's impossible to acknowledge the historical context. It's not impossible to be educated on historical context. It's not impossible to learn and be educated about the systems of oppression and racism and still believe that you can do something to make a change, or that you can do something to add to the change without blaming everybody else. I still think those two things can happen together. To me, it's very simple. If we're going to stand here and say, not every Black person is a criminal, not every Black person is a threat, then you got to stay saying here and say, not every police is racist. Not every police person is trying to kill you. Not every white person is racist and against you. There's a lot of people that won't understand that, well, we can't live in their shoes. They can't live in our shoes. There's some people that don't care to even empathize with us and that are racist. Absolutely. But if we don't want to be generalized, we can't then generalize everybody. And I've met many people with defeatist attitudes, with victim mentality attitudes, and me being anecdotal doesn't mean everyone's like this, but that just using peer sampling terms, where if it's happening with a large group of people, it's probably happening somewhere else. And so it's a reason we have these conversations in literature and everything. And that's this idea that we got to get out of a defeatist attitude. And when I talk about the historical context of why the crime numbers are the way they are, that's part of it. Part of it was being disenfranchised. Part of it is being put down to feel lesser than. Part of it is choking off resources to certain areas so that people born in those areas have less of a chance, not no chance, but they have less of a chance of doing something productive to progress their capital. and more of a chance of going into something criminal that then leads to more interactions with the police. And so all of that historical context is there, but part of it was the building of this victim mentality. Part of it was building the mentality of I'm lesser than. And some people fully go with it to the point where they are happy to point out every single time a white person does something and then turn around and do the same type of things. And I talked about this idea that you can't, people say you can't be racist if you're black. Or that basically, in some people's eyes, also that if they're doing it, it harms me. If we're doing it, it doesn't really harm me. There are some people that think that as well. And I say those are problematic. And so that all kind of leads into the same conversation about this mentality. And so she goes on to talk about, what other group of people uses hashtags to free rappers who did illegal things, like free, such and such. And I'll say this, because now we get into the jail part. There's a lot of gray in that. There is, I'm not going to talk right now about rap and everything, but there's a lot of people that are having conversations about hip hop and rap, and they're not so much interested in this idea of freedom and creativity anymore. They're trying to call it problematic. That how can we talk about police and everybody killing us, and then we have people that actually killed us, or people that openly talk about killing us and we glorify it. I'm not getting into that, but that's out there. So that's part of this conversation. Now, I don't really like the one she brought up with Meek Mill, because that's a bad choice to pick. Because within all of this talk about crime, as I said, you have to take into account the factors that are disproportionately going to increase the chances that we lead there. Not only that, then you're also discounting the fact of the power police have to do things that it doesn't matter if you were innocent, you can end up there too. And so that she makes a comment about how hard is it to avoid multiple basically hard is it to avoid multiple jail stints? How hard is it not to be a violent criminal, police encounters, blah, blah, blah. How hard is it to be an upstanding citizen? Now, to me, that is full of privilege. That is full of privilege. And I know for some reason people want to reserve privilege for just white people. That's not true. Privilege obviously is a word that can mean a lot of things. I think when you say stuff like that, and again, I don't know her, and I meant to look up, her whole background or whatever, but I am assuming right here, so correct me if I'm wrong. I encourage pushback, but I'm assuming you're somebody that did not have to grow up around these circumstances, because that statement is something that I hear from privileged people. Are those people often European descent, Caucasian? Yeah, they are. But I don't stop it at them, because it hasn't been just them. It's been people of all countries and creeds that have privilege and have said things like that. The pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality. And so you sit here and say, how hard is it? A, you never had to go through it. So it's not really genuine for you to say something like that. But on top of that, even if you didn't, if you just even worked in that system, if you worked around it, if you've been with those people, you would know it's pretty hard. But again, if you just look at numbers and say you're doing this, why are you not just not doing that? You discount the context. And so when you think about how you're socialized, and a lot of people have the privilege of 2-parent households, have the privilege of economic support, have the privilege of involved parents, whether it's 1 or 2, have the privilege of neighborhood resources, have the privilege of being developed, and we can go to child development. And at the end of the day, because again, you could be in the middle of the slums. I personally believe the right parenting can not cure all that, obviously, but can push you through. And we've seen it many times. But I think the privilege of having that childhood development, coming up with a certain mindset, a certain resiliency, a certain self-efficacy, which is a psychological thing, and it's a very big belief system that you can do it, that you can achieve it, that you don't have the fear, that you don't have the barriers, that you don't have the hoops to jump through, that you didn't get caught up by anything, that you didn't have things around you that might be caught up. If you have the privilege of leadership, then you don't know what it means and how hard it can be to escape that. And I use leadership because in my education, leadership is at its fundamental core is someone that can remove the barriers for the people that they're leading before they reach them. And for great parents, you do remove those barriers. Not to say you do everything for the child, but you remove some of those outside barriers and structures so that they have the freedom to grow and to get things done in their way. And if you had that privilege, then yeah, it might seem pretty easy. But as somebody that, quote unquote, from anybody else's perspective, did it the right way, I can tell you there's many turns that could have went the other way. And that even there's times where that did not matter. And that's what essentially this all comes down to. I don't wear a degree on my face. I don't wear it on my back or on my arms. I don't wear any education. I don't wear any awards. I don't wear anything on me but the color of my skin. And so to say it's just easy, you could do all the right things and still end up on the wrong side of police brutality and whatever. I've had situations, in any situation, if a cop didn't like me, or let's say I exercised my right to ask questions or refuse things and they didn't like that, or let's just say I was being polite but they are just really racist, they don't like me, black, white, doesn't matter what the police is. They have the power to do things that can strip me of my freedom. And they are going to be believed. They're going to have the power of the police behind them. They're going to have the power of the state behind them. I've seen it. The law system is rigged. And so to sit here and say how hard is it, ask so many innocent people that have sat and rot in jail and how many people are still there. So that's what I'll say about that. So again, I will say though, there are sentiments from Candace that I feel for. And this idea that there is too much blame on the other. I think you can recognize that, call it out, and still recognize and call out the issues, not only that we have going on with ourselves, but to also push against that narrative by doing something with ourselves. It's real nice that people want to hashtag and screen capture and get all these people fired and all that. That's cool. But how about we also invest in our community? How about we invest in our youth? How about we start putting in the work and the narratives that will push against the things that we have been taught? And I don't think there's a one-stop solution. I don't think it's this or that. I think part of it is eradicating some people power. I also think part of it is building up our own self-efficacy within our own community and our own people. And I do think part of it is collaborating with our allies that do want to do the right thing. So I think it's a bit of both, or a bit of all that. And so, yeah. So anyway, that's it for me. Go to the comment section. Let me know what you think. Share it around. Get the conversation started. Thumbs up, subscribe, and thank you for going out of bounds.